Hello, I'm Aaron Abrams and I'm Dungeon Dad. Dungeon Dad is a channel where I talk about playing Dungeons and Dragons with my children. I have three kids, Logan, Reagan, and Hudson. Hudson's only 4, so he doesn't play the game with us yet. He thinks he does, but he just kind of plays with the figures on the map. But we've been playing, Logan and Reagan and I, for about a year and a half. And we've been playing through the Temple of Elemental Evil. And we are reaching the climactic stage of that scenario. So I thought it would be nice to sort of do a retrospective of how we got to where we are. A year or more is a common amount of time it takes to get through Temple of Elemental Evil. It's one of the largest adventures that has been published, written by Gary Gygax around 1984 or so, and was originally based on part of his original Greyhawk campaign. My son Logan is now 11. He was just turning 10 when we started playing, and my daughter Reagan was just turning 8, and she's now 9. And I introduced them to the game on a road trip up to, we were driving up to Vancouver. So I brought my D&D books along, and we made characters for the kids. Now my philosophy of how to roll up Dungeons and Dragons characters as a DM, I give the players a choice. You can roll for each stat 4d6 and drop the lowest one, take the 3 highest to get your 3 to 18 range stats. Or you can roll 5d6, taking the top 3, giving you higher stats, but if you choose the 5d6 option, you have to take the rolls in the order they came. Strength, Dexterity, Constitution, Intelligence, Wisdom, Charisma. If you do the 4d6 option, you can arrange them in any order you want. So, for example, if you wanted to be a wizard, you would choose the 4d6 option and you would put your highest stat into Intelligence. Whereas if you want higher scores overall, you use the 5d6 option, but you sort of organically generate which of your stats is going to be the highest, which sometimes is fun on its own right, especially if you don't already have a character concept in mind. So both Logan and Reagan chose to take the 5d6 option when we originally made their characters. Logan rolled up his character, and the scores he rolled were 14 Strength, 16 Dexterity, 11 Constitution, 13 Intelligence, 14 Wisdom, and 15 Charisma. We talked about the various character classes and what was the best class for somebody with a high dexterity and relatively high strength. And Logan decided he wanted to be like Legolas from Lord of the Rings, so he decided to be an Elven Ranger. We then rolled Reagan's stats, and Reagan's scores, even with a 5d6 roll, she ended up with an 8 strength, a 17 dexterity, a 13 constitution, 9 intelligence, 13 wisdom, and 18 charisma. So Reagan decided to be a sorceress, their high charisma. I asked them what they wanted their names to be, and they agreed they wanted to be brother and sister, so Reagan was also going to be an elf. So I asked them what they wanted their names to be, and they decided that they wanted their names to be Logan and Reagan. Maybe due to their age, wasn't very imaginative, but I remember back to reading about how the very first D&D player was Gary Gygax's son Ernie, or Ernest, and the very first D&D character was his wizard Tensor, which is an anagram for Ernest, so we're in good company. So we had Logan the Ranger and Reagan the Sorceress, brother and sister elves. And on the road trip, I was just taking them through a random dungeon. I was actually using a map that I'd pulled off the internet first from the first level of Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord, which was a wizardry computer game I used to play when I was 15 years old. And so I was populating the dungeon using just the random encounter section of the Dungeon Master's Guide. So this was enough of an experience of playing the game for Logan and Reagan to find that they enjoyed playing Dungeons and Dragons. But it quickly became clear to me that we were going to need a plot to keep them interested. There had to be a story. Just doing random monster encounters was going to get old pretty quick. Now, right away, I told them that just one ranger and one sorceress traveling together in the dungeon was probably not going to be a good idea. They needed some help. So, even before we went in the dungeon, we had a little tavern encounter, and I rolled up some random NPCs. So the first random NPC that they met who joined their party was a half-orc fighter named Shrek. Shrek, for half-orc. Not an ogre, a half-orc, but still, okay, I wasn't being very imaginative. And the second one was a human wizard named Monty. Named him after Monty Hall, for those of you who are old enough to remember him. So Shrek, Monty, Logan, and Reagan in the dungeon had a couple of encounters. And the one thing that became very clear very quickly, even before I concluded that they would soon get bored if there wasn't a story, was that they needed a cleric. Otherwise, they pretty much had to come out after every encounter. So we added one more character to the mix, and that was a female cleric named Morgan. Morgan was a cleric of Ouijas, a goddess of death, lawful neutral. So she's not evil, but she's not good. Sort of imagine sort of a goth girl, a little bit of a dark side. And when she does channel her divine energy to affect undead, she does affect undead like an evil cleric, not a good cleric. So rather than turning undead, she can command them, which became interesting and helpful later during the Temple of Elemental Evil. So we played a couple of sessions on the road trip, and I said to the kids, when we get back home, I've got a cool old adventure that I played when I was in high school and again when I was in college. I'm going to run you through it. Hopefully, I can, use some of my experience of remembering what was good and what wasn't as good when I did it before, and it should be fun. So they were excited about that. Little resistance to starting over. They didn't want to go back down to 0 experience points because I awarded them experience points for the encounters that we had. But they were on board with the idea. So shortly after returning from our trip to Canada, and this was in January, a year and a half ago, so that would be January of 2018. Yes. 2018 had just started. We started our game. Now, since it was going to be Temple of Elemental Evil, I decided I was basically going to run them through a Greyhawk campaign. Ultimately, the idea is eventually to take them through many of the classic World of Greyhawk adventures. I have a whole list of things that I want to take them through. Next on the list, which we should be starting in just a couple of months, as we're very close to finishing Temple of Elemental Evil, would be White Plume Mountain, which should be a hoot. Anyway, since we are now starting a real campaign in I don't want to say a real world, a real fantasy world, a real fake world, I wanted to give the characters some background. So, Logan and Reagan were elves from the kingdom of Selene, which is to the south of the area where Greyhawk is, and the closest large human city is the city of Verbabonk. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but that is the largest human city in the area where the Temple of Elemental Evil is. And at the time that the campaign begins, Logan is 130 years old, and Reagan is 120 years old. So as elves, they are just coming of age. And I told them that they had been called in to the local nobility, and they are being assigned a coming of age quest. And there's an elven noble has gone missing with her entire party that was traveling through the lands is gone. Well, many different bands of elven adventurers have been sent out to different places to try to find her. Now we have these two young people who are supposed to go on their first ever quest. And so the queen has assigned them a task. Basically, keeping all the bases covered, she's going to send them somewhere that there's very little chance that anything will come of it. So she assigns them to check out a human village called Hamlet, and their basic assignment is to talk to everyone in the village, get to know everyone in the village, see if there's anyone in the village who has any knowledge of what happened to the elven noble woman and her party that is missing, and follow any leads that may eventually lead to the rescue of the noblewoman. And if the leads completely dry up, which is what they're expecting, come home. The queen does not know that there are leads in the village of Hamlet, which will lead to bigger leads, which will lead to bigger leads, which will eventually lead to them actually fulfilling the mission of the rescue. The best warriors in her kingdom are following up the leads that they think are going to help find them, but those are dead ends. And it is, in fact, Logan and Reagan who will ultimately find the leads that may possibly, come on, we know that it's going to, lead to the rescue. But much, much more, because there is much more to the Temple of Elemental Evil. So, the coming of age quest is going to begin at the village of Hamlet. So they've traveled north through the lands of Selene into the Cron Hills, where the village of Hamlet is, and they are on the road just south of the village at the time that the module says the adventure begins. And that's where the adventure officially starts. And so that is where I'm going to leave you today. Next time, we're going to talk about Logan and Reagan's adventures in the village of Hamlet, Logan and Reagan's first experiences with role-playing, and some of the ways that I fleshed out the actions in the village of Hamlet using information from the Temple of Elemental Evil, things that were added for the video game version, which I never owned and never played, but I found an online walkthrough, and so I used some of the mini quests that are in the village to flesh out things that happen in the village, and so it's an interesting experience playing with my kids. Who Logan was just about the same age that I was when I first started playing 39 years ago. When my mother bought me the D&D Red Box set in 1980. And so Logan and Reagan are here we are a year and a half later, they're hooked. And so until next time, I am the Dungeon Dad reminding you, don't kill your kids' characters. That's what the NPCs are for.